So again, thank you very much. And I was actually struck by several things that Elizabeth just talked about. One of them was, about flexibility and not necessarily having that plan just kind of come out. And one of the things that really struck me is that in the Air Force, we used to have a phrase that said, flexibility is the key to air power. But there was a follow-on that said, indecision is the key to flexibility. and so there's an awful lot of being able to react and be able to have some sort of ability to know and be kind of true to not only yourself, but also kind of to that North Star. I am at the Bush School, where I have the privilege of teaching information technology course with a healthy dose of Catholic social teaching. Or as some people would say, how to ethically yell at your IT department. But what we have here is the opportunity to look at organizations. And what we're going to do here with this panel is perhaps something a little bit different. I'm going to frame up a scenario, and frame up, we have this wonderful panel here, and I have to also extend an apology from Dr. Andrasik, again, referencing Elizabeth's talk. Her baby unfortunately fell off the changing table yesterday and fractured his skull, we think. So she's at an MRI as we speak. So if you happen to have a moment or two to say a prayer for a healthy outcome, that would be wonderful. But what I told her is that please come, bring the baby. And I think it would just be a wonderful opportunity to show that work and life do indeed balance out. And I thought it would be very appropriate per Elizabeth's talk. But what we have here are not only international businessmen and practitioners and professionals, they all bring a perspective of the organization. And if we think about the organization as that wonderful container of solidarity and subsidiarity that contributes to the common good, that at its core contributes to human dignity, because through work, as we've heard in so many different speeches, so many different talks, through work, we allow the individual to have that appropriate allocation of their talents matched to that work. And again, it was inspired by what Elizabeth was talking about, is that how do you actually go and grow the firm, go and grow the individual, but go and grow the human dignity? So what we're going to talk about here, again, we're going to start with Phil Sotak, who's, again, an international businessman, has a wonderful opportunity to have started businesses, not only domestically, but internationally. John Almendas, who's, again, a professor extraordinaire over at IESE, has written extensively about the community of persons, about how organizations are coming together. And of course, our own Brandon Vaidyanathan. Did I get that right?
Sure.
All right. Brandon V on the drums, ladies and gentlemen. But what we have here, again, is somebody internationally inclined who has been able to look at multiple organizations and look at what is the tensions and perhaps even the tolerances, and how vulnerabilities of leadership can contribute, again, to human dignity. If Patricia shows up, we were actually going to talk about space and how space can influence not only human dignity, but also the outcomes of productivity and the outcomes of all of those virtues that we've been talking about. So again, the idea here is about 4 to 5 minutes for each of the speakers, and then we're just going to, I'm going to channel my inner John McLaughlin and shout out issues, and we're going to go ahead and go through it. So Bill, why don't we go ahead and start with
Lawrence.
you?
I'll go stand. Is the mic working? Can you guys? It is. Okay. Well, thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, everybody, for this opportunity to come and to share, to learn together. The last couple of days have been truly kind of an experience of community for me, so I thank you for that. So we were asked to prepare some thoughts in response to the question, where are we headed in business? And what are the virtues required to get us there? And so Steve mentioned yesterday Harvard professor Michael Porter, and he said something recently that I read that was striking. He said this idea of shared value that suggests that businesses aren't here just for the sake of profit, they're here for the sake of profit and perhaps purpose. That idea would revolutionize capitalism. And so I think there's no doubt there exists plenty of data showing a high correlation between purpose and profit now. And it suggests that a company, when they strive for this, they get the environment right, and everybody flourishes, everybody wins. And so we're seeing more and more companies move in this direction and wrestle with how best to deliver meaningful value to various stakeholders. So they're starting to look at employees and the community and society at large in a different way, seeing them as members of their cause, contributors to their vision and value. So it's kind of like a proper ordering of things where business looks at maybe the human person first and relative to the human person. So business serves the person type of an idea. And certainly this is a paradigm shift for management, leadership, and organizational design. It's born from many thought leaders who are challenging us as business leaders to humanize our organization. And their promise, if we do so, is great culture, and maybe perhaps a move from good to great, to reference Jim Collins. And so a most notable management model for humanizing our organization is to become purpose-centric. We've heard this concept, idea of purpose-driven. It's not to be confused with merely having a statement of purpose. No, because those that are truly purpose-driven connect at a human level, and they measure success in a different way. They measure success relative to the person's fulfillment rather than their objective output. And they talk in terms of contribution and unity, and they structure, manage, and organize the business accordingly. So this is the paradigm shift, I think, that will continue to unfold in the coming years, I think, because it must primarily be, as people come into the organization, if we don't make this shift, then organizations are going to become relevant to the people coming in, to the workforce coming in. So let's just call that a new management logic, this idea of running our business not from the perspective of what and how, but from the perspective of why being our ultimate end game. And it will require that we look at everything in the business through a lens of purpose. Our strategies, our structures, our plan systems, and most certainly the people within our organizations. And that's an important point that well-established purpose-driven organizations could push even further, is this idea of looking at the person through the lens of purpose. It's not merely to look at their skills or their competencies, but it's to look at their unique reason for being. Only from that point of departure can we truly co-create together, as we're called to do. And so this logic clearly steps us toward humanizing our organizations because it puts the priority on the person. I think Elizabeth just mentioned the quote from Herb Kelleher. This is, in no uncertain terms, a way of bringing love into the workplace. So practically speaking, we will see an evolution, I think, from the practice of managing people from tacit goals and objectives and tasks toward an activation or some sort of activation of their respective and collective purposes, right? Their reasons for being. I say plural because we're talking about individuals here. And the connection is critical. The connection between the person's reason for being and the organization's reason for being is critical. Otherwise, purpose falls flat. And so what might this look like in, the ever-changing, complex business world that we live in today? Well, to answer that is perhaps answers the second part of the question. What are the virtues or the practices required in getting us there? And the two virtues, I think, that are critical as we move further into the 21st century are the virtues of magnanimity and humility. Magnanimity is a word I did not know too many years ago. And magnanimity is this idea of a desire to do great things, but doing it through the greatness of others. So it's a servant leadership concept. And then humility, which was emphasized yesterday by Tim, right? We all struggle with this. Humility, knowing self, but really knowing self relative to others so we can understand how best we might serve them. And these two must go together, because magnanimity without humility has its certain pitfalls, as does humility without magnanimity. So they must go together. Why are these two virtues critical? I believe they can be the foundations for a cultural reform, one that we can create ourselves from within our spheres of influence, because they are the best framework we know of for imitating Christ in the workplace and for bringing Christ into the workplace. So these two virtues not only help us to live out the first 2 commandments through our work, but they are a framework for answering the highest of purposes, a purpose with a capital P, call it, our collective calling, which is love God and love people. And so if we are called to create a community of persons unifying the parts of the body, then it must be understood to come from within each of us. That's to say, the purpose of an organization is actually the expression of each person's purpose within the organization. So that's what we want to align. That's our end game. In a sense, the person is our end game and everything else is simply an output. So the obvious big opportunity we all have here is that we can do this. We can create these high-purpose environments where people can respond to their calling, can give of themselves freely in the workplace, and ultimately establish a higher level of relationship with those around them. That was John Paul II's call to action for all entrepreneurs and his recipe, so to speak, for a higher level of communion in the workplace. So to enter this opportunity, to embrace it with consistency and conviction, and to find perhaps that sweet spot of purpose and profit in our organizations, we will need to be both magnanimous and humble. That's my...
Great, thank you. Yes, please.
Good job.
Oh, thanks, brother.
So wonderful. That was very insightful. Thank you very much. And I wanted to continue along the same lines. And in my talk, I'm going to be addressing some of the, starting with John Paul II, one of the things that first struck me when I was started to read Social Doctrine of the Church, this idea that the purpose of business is not simply to make a profit, but its very existence as a community of persons, right? So this is something that I think different trends that we see now are highlighting that point, that companies are also a community of persons. And I think also, I'm going to be talking about some of these trends and making a connection also with a common language that we have. Of course, most people here are Catholic, practicing Catholics, but it's not necessarily something that we bring into our sleep, that we talk about Catholicism often in the workplace. And this common language that we have with them, that I will be addressing here, gives us also an opportunity to make a very positive impact in the culture of our business. So the first thing connected with this community of persons is how that is how often do we hear now about purpose within our organization? This is a trend that you have also highlighted. It is a trend that we see that is very, very, very present. And just to make the point more clear, like one of the things that recently the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, many of you have probably read this, he said, addressing a letter to all company CEOs, he said, "Society is demanding that companies, both public and private, serve a social purpose. To prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution to society." I mean, if you think about it, this is striking. This is the financial sector is like the largest investor, making a point that you companies have to have a social purpose beyond making money, right? So can you think of it as like the finance, being like a force for good in society, right? This is sort of what we're hearing about here, a force for good. So where will things end up, right? So there's other, you hear also about impact investing and other trends where you see finance actually entering into this fray. But then you also see other CEOs taking a stand on issues that have immediately nothing to do with their proper business. Like yesterday, we heard about David Green talking about freedom of conscience, right? Hobby Lobby. Dan Cathy of Chick-fil-A entering into the fray or into the battle about marriage. So it's not simply about thinking about the company from within and whatever is interesting to our shareholders, that's what we do. There's broader concerns also about broader society, which I think is a new trend, it's an interesting trend, and it's something that we as Catholics as well have to be present there and say, okay, what is it that we in our companies do to contribute to society more largely? It is a factor, and it seems that society is giving more attention to that factor, making a positive impact to society. So it's part of that shared language. Another key trend that I see is how we are becoming to see more and more clear that what most contributes to the creation of wealth is actually the human mind, right? It's ingenuity. And it's striking to see all of these great companies that are coming now into existence. You can start with Apple and Facebook and Google. That is basically a great idea, right? That is carrying the day. The time that it takes for these companies to reach $1 billion in value seems to be getting shorter and shorter over time. Like Google started in 1998. It took them only almost about 10 years to reach that threshold. But then Facebook in 2004, some years later, they reached that threshold of $1 billion in just a little over 5 years. And it seems that the time for these great companies gets shorter and shorter over time. Uber in 2009, in a little bit less than 3 years. And you keep going and going. WhatsApp and then Snapchat, the time gets shorter and shorter over time. So what that highlights is ideas, is ingenuity. This is what is driving value creation. This is something that is striking, and everybody notices that. And it's also an opportunity for us to see this is what brings value to companies, great ideas. Those ideas may not always come at the top. There's probably in this room, there may be lots of great ideas to create value in society. And I think it's part of the reason why we find companies like Google, who have the money to do so, who are pampering their employees, stay with us, to retain and attract new talent. And we see also many companies that are also very innovative and trendsetters that are treating everybody equally, right? So the partners of this organization, regardless of how much they contribute this year to the bottom line, they get paid equally. And whenever they receive high profitability, they also share their profits equally. So there's the sense that you stand not because of your rank in the company, but because of your ideas, and that's the value of the person, right? That's something that we see that is a trend, and I think it is also interesting. So it's part of the common language that we as Catholics share with others. The people are important. Are we building people? Are we attracting the right people for our organization? Another interesting trend that I see is maybe not so much only focusing on people, but focusing also on great teams. So that we innovate when we make also decisions, when we see collectively and we improve on each other's thinking because we work together very well. That's very good for innovation, and that's very good for learning in organization. And that is also what seems to be creating more and more value. A great book on this subject is look at the story of Pixar, like how they help each other innovate by giving each other feedback. And you see that now even more when you consider that the environment is constantly changing, and now you need very adaptable and agile organizations. Given the volatility and the uncertainty of today's environment, you need everybody thinking, and you need everybody to contribute to the thinking of everybody else in the organization so that they make very fast decisions. A great example of this I saw in the company Haier, a Chinese company that they make white goods, household appliances, and now they also make televisions and phones, etc. But what they want to do as a company, as an organization, is what they call producing like zero distance between employees and customers, getting hierarchy out of the way within organizations so that people can very quickly contribute to what they see as the developing needs of the customers. Right? So a company that is creating great teams, self-managed for the most part, great teams to better adapt to the needs of the customers and evolve continuously, right? So it's a community of increased interdependence in organization. That's something that we're seeing. And lastly, I want to emphasize also the inclusion seems to be a very important value that we see in organizations, which might be very important if it's true, which it seems to be, that is very true, that because of automation and artificial intelligence, many jobs, at least in the short term, will be redundant. And so what do we do to include into our companies people who are in the peripheries of society? And you see some interesting developments there. So SEP just recently was saying that we would like that by the year 2020 that we will have like 1% of our employees who are actually autistic, right? So the people who have been marginalized in society, not being able to find good jobs, and yet they have some capabilities that could be actually quite useful for organizations, and creating an opportunity for them could be also a win-win. Another example is Wegmans, right? It's this company that whose CEO was approached by the mayor of Rochester and say, listen, in New York, we have a lot of problems in this community with high school dropouts. What can you do to help us address that problem? So they create, I guess, a business model that incorporates that need in society and actually create win-win situations as well. So community, but also a community that is not exclusive, that is also incorporating others, and I think that's also a very positive trend that could be very useful for us. So can we bring community into the workplace in ways that we create win-wins as well? So thank you.
Great, thank you. So great points, thank you.
Over to the podium there. Good morning. Thank you all for having me. It's really an honor. So I'm a sociologist, and I study organizational cultures in business and in science and in faith communities. And I study how these cultures emerge and then what effects they have on the people who inhabit those organizations. And I look at workplaces as institutions that form us as well as deform us. Right? And this happens less often through the formal values that an organization professes, and more often through the hidden curriculum into which people are socialized in that organization. So I'll give you a few examples of what I mean by this. So for one of my books, I interviewed more than 100 corporate professionals in India and the Middle East who are all working as middle managers in Fortune 500 companies. And I was surprised to learn that they described themselves as mercenaries. Okay, so they would tell me, I'm not loyal to the company. Right? I'm loyal to the cash. The company doesn't care about you, so why should you care about the company? Right? These are folks working in major global firms. I mean, IBM, Dell, Accenture, HP, et cetera. And the company's formally espoused values were all the same lofty ideals you hear everywhere. We value integrity, we value quality, we're a family, right? But when you spend time with the leadership in these organizations, and I did ethnographic work and was there for a couple of years, you see these leaders rolling their eyes at this. Okay? They know that really to succeed in this organization, you got to suck up to this guy, you got to stab this other guy in the neck, right? That's what it takes to get ahead. That's the nature of the game. You don't like the game? Go become a social worker. That's what they tell me, right? So this is the hidden curriculum you pick up in a lot of organizations. And these professionals work in a toxic environment of what I call apprehensive individualism, right? They believe you should not trust anyone here because everyone's just trying to climb the ladder, right? They're themselves just trying to protect themselves. So you dare not be vulnerable in any way, or people will take advantage of you, right? You start planning your departure from the company the day you arrive, right? You want to stay a couple of years so it doesn't look like you're flaky on your resume. But if you're in a company 10 years, people say, what's wrong with you? You're stagnating. Why are you still here, right? So work as such had no meaning for these people, right? It was purely a means to an end. And even for the committed Christians and Catholics there, they saw their primary vocation as being to their families and to their faith communities, but work was just something you do to provide for your family, just a means to an end. No sense of work itself as a vocation. Now, I want to contrast this to another book that just came out this year called The Culture Code by the journalist Daniel Coyle. And he studied a number of high-performing organizations across a variety of sectors, corporations, army units, medical departments, and so on. And he found 3 characteristics of these high-performing cultures. First, safety. You feel safe. You feel at home in these organizations. You feel a sense of belonging. You can let your guard down, right? Meanwhile, the people I studied felt deeply afraid and unsafe. They'd say, I don't try to get to know anyone here because I don't want to be betrayed. Plus, it'll be easier for me to leave when I move on, right? And this idea that you are going to move on is taken for granted in these organizations. I interviewed the HR director of a major global firm, and at the beginning of the interview, he complained about the high rate of attrition. And 10 minutes into the interview, he was telling me, well, 3 years from now, I'm hoping I'm going to be at this other firm in this other city. Right? Didn't even recognize the irony at all. It didn't even occur to him that there was a problem there, right? So, but this is a deeply ingrained sense of this is how the game is played here, right? So everything from the policies to the interactions to the aesthetics, the use of space in an organization can communicate to people either that you matter, you belong here, you are a person of worth, right? And I think that's what can create a culture of fearlessness, like as we heard at Southwest. Or it communicates to you that we don't care about you, you're expendable, okay? And this is what creates the toxic mercenary culture that I've seen. Second, so that was safety. Second is vulnerability. The leader in particular has to be vulnerable and to be willing to admit, I screwed up, to be willing to take the flak. And people need to see leaders embody the virtue of humility. People think that it's trust in an organization that brings forth vulnerability, but Coyle argues no, it's vulnerability that creates trust. Unless you have people who are willing, leaders in particular, who are willing to be vulnerable, you can't create trust in an organization. But in the organizations I studied, it was just the opposite. Leaders felt they always had to appear in control. You could never let your guard down. Don't let anyone see that you're not completely in charge. Otherwise, you're expendable. Third, purpose. And Phil and John have both talked about this already. The organization has to have a really clear sense of purpose, not just the sort of mission statement, right? I mean, a real sense of why do we exist? What are we really striving for? Why do we matter? Okay, and to communicate, here's why we're doing this, and over-communicate this to people across the organization. Here's why your role matters. Here's how your contribution is crucial for us, valuable to us. You look at a team like San Antonio Spurs, right? So you have coaches who are able to do this exceptionally well, but a lot of organizations don't do that. Instead, what you're seeing, and this is another trend, is a proliferation of jobs that are simply window dressing. Okay, you hire a vice president, and everybody knows that a vice president needs 3 assistants, because that's what all these other companies are doing. So you end up with a bunch of jobs where people have to figure out how to do some make work. The anthropologist David Graeber has written a book on this called Bullshit Jobs. These are jobs where people feel, if my job didn't exist, it would make no difference at all. Okay, the organization would function just as well, maybe better. Okay? And so, I mean, he put out this essay a few years ago, and he got thousands of responses with people saying, yep, that's me, that's my job. And they're overwhelmingly white-collar jobs, not blue-collar jobs. The people in administration and law and finance and HR, they know that their job is just a waste of time. Okay, and that's an undermining of human dignity, right? It points to the fact that people want to work, and they want their work to have a sense of purpose. So we really have to take seriously the question, what kinds of organizations and organizational cultures do we want to create? Right? What are truly flourishing and healthy organizations? What do those look like? And the future we need to move towards is one in which we acknowledge that recognizing the dignity of persons means recognizing their unique creative capacity and desire to contribute to a higher purpose and harnessing that. And this is not just liberating for the individual, but it can also create healthy and flourishing organizations. You become a better person as a result of spending time in such organizations, as opposed to turning bitter and burnt out and defensive. Now, the challenge I've been struggling with is how do you move from a toxic organizational culture that undermines dignity and virtue to one that cultivates it? And I asked Daniel Coyle whether the mercenary organizations that I studied could become the kinds of culture that he described. He said, no way. He said, you got to throw everybody out and restart. But I'd like to hope there's another way, and so that could be perhaps part of our conversation today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. So it really appears that we have a common thread running through here, and it's going back to those virtues and again, that the Catholic social teaching elements that we have all talked about, that we instill not only within the Bush School, but also within our practice. So the first question I have here, because there was all an element of subsidiarity. In other words, let's either eliminate, level. Let's try to instill a sense of entrepreneurialism at the large company, being able to eliminate the bullshit job or whatever the case is. So the first thing I'm going to do, and Phil, let me start with you. In order to get the worker more connected with the customer, I mean, how do you do that within your work? How do you do that within your company?
Well, it starts with getting the person, first and foremost, more connected with themselves. So in our case, we do extensive workshops with everybody in the organization around an idea of personal mission. And so we start with helping, it's a self-awareness thing of getting yourself, understanding who you are relative to your coworkers, and then how can you express that purpose, that reason for being in the work that you're provided. So you don't necessarily have to connect to the cause of the organization or to the cause of the customer's organization, but you do have to understand what your contribution would be relative to that, right? And so I can go into an organization, I can be very inspired by their purpose, but if I don't know what my contribution is relative to that purpose, and that contribution has to come from within me and my purpose, then like I said, it falls flat. So it starts with understanding yourself first, and then you can express that, whether that's with coworkers, the community that you're within your organization, or most certainly other stakeholders, customers, community, and all those things, right?
Right.
It's really an integrity thing, because you can't be one person here and then somebody else at the customer.
The two-faced, right? The dual life. If you
so
will.
we work first on understanding that within ourselves.
Right. John, have you seen in your studies and certainly within your work, you certainly mentioned some wonderful large corporations, right? You know, you talked about the Apples and the Wegmans and everything else. Have you seen this kind of at the small to medium enterprise level? How does that impact?
So one interesting example that I use as a great metaphor for this way of team learning, where everybody's actually very, very engaged, is actually an orchestra without a conductor, where not having a conductor, somebody who is actually orchestrating and making decisions for what's going to be the interpretation of the piece, but actually letting that emerge from discussions of the orchestra members themselves, is something that is incredibly empowering and engaging, where you create the tone that you want for the organization, and you have more innovation and more leadership for not having a conductor. So this is something I have worked with the orchestra, and I brought them to my business school so that people actually see how they actually work. And we ask people, okay, could something like this work in your organizations? And in very hierarchical settings, they tell me, okay, this is completely impossible. Like how could you actually kind of bring decision making, the center of gravity so low that teams themselves are making all of these important strategic decisions? But then you find there's a great a YouTube video that you can actually see yourself on Spotify, with the engineering culture of Spotify, and they actually do that, right? So they are very innovative because they actually work, they give a lot of autonomy to those teams. They make decisions within areas that have been orchestrated for them to make decisions in, and then that escalates to the organization in multiple ways. So agile decision making in organizations is possible.
At all levels, no, regardless of the size of the enterprise, is what you're saying.
Regardless, yes.
Right.
And sometimes it's very difficult then to integrate that within a siloed organization, very hierarchical, that sometimes it exists like that also for a reason. So
right.
How do you integrate these two ways of working? But I came across with BBVA, a company with whom I discussed this example with them. They said this couldn't be working. And then one of the very employees of BBVA told me that, in fact, we're actually trying to implement this into our organization. And we have created ways of drawing resources from the organization so that we can work in this way in a very fast and agile way, and then contribute back to the divisions.
Right. I'm kind of curious, did you, talking to the musicians, were any of them saying, hey, my role is BS? Like, I'm the guy that plays the triangle, you know? It's like, I have to sit here and wait for like an hour and a half in order for me to do that. Is there anybody that kind of had that?
I haven't found that. I found actually people who are incredibly engaged in the job that they do, and they're actually very good as an orchestra.
Right.
So they're all the time in Carnegie Hall, which is
Right.
right across the street from ESA Business School where I am. So they're very, very good and very highly engaged.
Right.
Because they have the opportunity to bring their full selves into the job.
Right.
Not like in many other orchestras where they're simply just,
Mechanically following the notes, right?
Following the directions of the boss, right?
Yeah, so again, kind of matching the appropriation of the talent to the job at hand and really putting all yourself in there, even if your job is to hit the triangle, an hour and a half into the Stravinsky Orchestra. Got it.
So you do it with more passion.
With more passion and with purpose, that's right. You're sanctifying that triangle clink. So Brandon, kind of going back to, your experiences and, certainly share the Middle Eastern, experience in work. How does an organization that has a completely different outlook on life? I mean, have you looked and explored how do you actually practically change this toxicity when you have these different cultural norms and kind of this amalgamation of all different types of cultures and roles?
Yeah, I mean, finding an organization that's been able to successfully do it, when you have this toxic culture to begin with, that's immensely difficult. And I've seen organizations that from scratch are able to rebuild it.
Right.
And again, I mean, it's possible to have organizations that are based on a prior experience of humiliation. So I'll give you, an example from Italy, which is another set of studies I'm doing with some colleagues there, looking kind of at the hopeful side of where do you find organizations that are showing a promising way forward. One organization there, led by a guy called Brunello Cucinelli, it's a luxury clothing firm. When he grew up, he grew up in poverty, and his dad was a factory worker, and deeply humiliated over and over again, would come back home and saying, what did I do to God to deserve this kind of treatment?
Right.
And that made him, his son growing up watching his dad, promised to himself that whenever I get into business, I am going to create an organization that values human dignity, will never exploit people. And so
Right.
that's what he's built. He's built this massive sort of, really a revolution in the fashion industry, because they, it's an organization centered around human dignity. They pay their workers 20% more than industry standard. They have these policies that are very unusual. You have to go home for a lunch break, and it's an hour-and-a-half long lunch break, and you can't work on evenings and weekends. No email, strictly forbidden. And they constantly reinforce. I mean, a lot of it was inspired also by the monastic tradition too. So they drew a lot from really healthy forms of work, and tried to rebuild a kind of. The fashion industry is very exploitative, right?
Right.
So trying to really be a beacon of light in that industry is quite remarkable. But it comes from these sorts of experience of humiliation. So it's possible for this dark side to somehow serve as as fertilizer for
Right.
something new.
And I think, I recall you talking about this gentleman in the enterprise, and you also talked a little bit about the strategic planning, and it's not just a 5-year
Yeah, no,
strategic
it's a
plan.
200-year vision.
200-year
It's a
vision.
long-term commitment to
Right.
investment in local community, the long-term investment in the development of artisans in that region. So beyond just the success of the company itself.
Right, so taking a community of persons perspective in many respects, a lot of what we were talking about, again, enhancing that dignity, driving the solidarity, driving that whole contribution. So, one of the things we're pretty good about talking about is the theory behind a lot of this, but again, as practitioners, as people have run businesses, what are kind of the 3 takeaways that every single one of us can implement, say, tomorrow, well, Saturday, so Tuesday maybe, so, right, yeah.
I'll give you a couple of days.
Before we get into that, maybe another example of a
Yeah.
company that was transformed that I think is also quite interesting, and transformed also along the lines of purpose and mission, is, I don't know if you're familiar with DaVita, which is a kidney dialysis organization.
Sure.
So when Ken Theory was asked to be the CEO of that organization in the year 1999, it was an organization that was floundering for many different reasons, operational and cultural. And so he was a person that was like very directive, very much focused on results and the operations, excellence in operations. But he brought also with it he wanted a cultural transformation of the organization as well, where mission would be critical. And he had all sorts of rituals to bring that home. Like he dressed like the 3 Musketeers with so one for all and all for one, and they would have big parties to emphasize the unity of the organization, and made people also come to see like how the service that they were providing to these people that are suffering a lot, that have to go like 3 times a week for 4 hours to actually receive this treatment, that they were making a very positive impact on them. So it's a whole cultural transformation and very quick turnaround of the organization. The turnover dropped dramatically in the organization. The patients themselves wanted to come back because they felt more at home in the organization. So it's interesting that creating that sense of purpose is also something that could have like very positive even business results as well.
That's right.
It has to be driven by the leader, which is really crucial, I
Right.
think, to see. And that's where the kind of resistance I see in the people I talk to. They say, our senior leaders are not going to do this. They're not going to even buy in. They don't care enough, right? So compare that to this example.
Well, it's a huge difference, and it's simply, it also seems to be there's an accountability mechanism. We'll get to kind of the 3 points later, but if we think about sovereign wealth funds that control so many different things, whether it is within the Middle East or whether it's in China or Indonesia or whatever the case is, there's a different accountability structure. And I would argue that the accountability structure doesn't necessarily contribute to that subsidiarity or to the full, again, appropriation of your talents. So, let's kind of think about that in terms of the structure. To whom are we accountable as we're actually creating this? So, are we a leader merely following the mechanized elements of the checklist so we can get through the day? Or are we, again, purpose-driven and mission-driven? And, Phil, you're, again, running international businesses and these types of things. Let me combine the two. What have you seen? What's kind of the best governance and accountability mechanism that you use or that you've seen? And perhaps even a disastrous one that you've seen.
Well, and John mentioned something that I hadn't thought of in that perspective when he mentioned this concept of agile, and organizations are flirting with new ways of structuring their organization away from the old industrial structures of hierarchy that we all grew up in. And that's a structure that gets close to the idea of subsidiarity, or there's opportunity there for subsidiarity to occur.
Right.
And I think that's a trend that we're seeing, and you're seeing organizations, Hire is one of them, Zappos, there's a lot of organizations out there that are starting to try to create these structures and environments that allow for these things,
Right.
that allow for purpose to happen, that allow for, in our case, subsidiarity and solidarity and some of those things. So that's interesting. There's not a formula out there that I could say is working, but back to your accountability question, we think about it if you just in your mind think of a triangle and you have your organizational principles and values at the top, you have your systems and your processes on one side, and you have your leadership behaviors and practices on the other. Those 3 points of the organization have to have integrity. And just to give you an example, and Brandon was mentioning this too, if you have an organization that professes certain principles and values, but has systems and practices within that are counter to that, then it's really telling its employees, here, we want you to be like this, but here are the tools we're giving you, which are inconsistent with how we're telling you that we want you to act on a daily basis. What that creates is incoherence between the people and the organizational direction. And the same thing goes with the principles that you have in your organization, values relative to your leadership behaviors, right? That's an obvious one that if those principles are not acted out and behaved in a consistent way, then you have inauthenticity. So that whole thing together is kind of an integrity question, right? And either one of those sides of the triangle are broken, you have kind of a bit of a death spiral. So that's, from an accountability perspective, those are the 3 points, the dots that we try to connect within our organization, is how are we structuring this and behaving, and what are the tools and systems we're putting in place to do what we say we want to do and to be how we say we want to be. That's our accountability framework, I guess.
Well, I think it's important, and then of course you have to have the policies, and you have to have the evaluations, and perhaps even the compensation that follows that. In terms of what you guys have seen, and John, you brought up a point about a company that kind of rewards everybody equally in certain things. How do you guys see that? Is that, maybe you can explain a little bit more about that, because I took away perhaps maybe not what the intent was.
No, so the idea is not necessarily that equal pay for everybody is an ideal situation for organizations, but there could be settings where actually what you achieve by doing so is actually quite beneficial. When what you're pursuing, for instance, is innovation, and where the way in which you work actually is building on the ideas of each one, where you don't know exactly what was the source of the idea to begin with.
So again, very agile,
you're building on top of each other's ideas, and it's actually the team rather than the individual. So one of the ways that you can undermine the effectiveness of a team is by rewarding individuals rather than the team. So this could be a helpful way of achieving maximum results in terms of innovation.
Right.
It has to be driven by the team rather than by individuals. So that's what I meant by equal compensation. Sometimes can be helpful in some settings.
So in that case, is there room then, Brandon, Phil, is there room for individual bonuses or individual type of things? How would that work? What is your
I think there's an idea that I think we need to pay attention to, which is I'm going to call it disincentive systems, right? So to figure out, whenever you create any kind of structure, it has certain powers to either achieve what it is that you're trying to do, or to hamper that. And so incentive systems can do that. I've seen one example of where they tried to create a kind of pseudo-subsidiarity in an organization by having middle managers basically work on, identifying the losers in their team. So this one guy told me, look, I've got a team of 10 people. I've got to cultivate camaraderie and trust and teamwork for the whole year. And at the end of the year, I got to rank them on a scale of 1 to 10 and fire the guy at the bottom.
Right.
And he tells me, you tell me how I can function with integrity in this sort of system. Right. Because there's kind of a disincentive then for people to even contribute to that team, because they know it's competitive. They know it's set up ultimately that they're in competition with each other. So I think trying to figure out disincentive systems towards the kinds of behaviors that we want is crucial.
Right.
It's a simple concept. It's simple but not easy, I guess,
Right.
is what I'm trying to say there, is because those, again, if you look at those things, if you measure it differently, so if you start measuring from a perspective of fulfillment, from a perspective of purpose, from a perspective of whether or not the person is actually contributing in the way they can contribute versus, what's the output of the person, did they meet their annual objectives and so forth. It's really just a mindset shift. Really, it's not a crazy concept. It's just, can we look at these things through the lens of purpose? Can we put systems in the organization that are consistent with what we're saying we want to be and how we want our people to behave? It's instead of looking at those three things, detached and separately and saying, these are our values now, these are the systems that we've all grown up and know how to implement, and
Right.
these are the leadership behaviors that everybody's telling us that we need in order to be successful. It's all disconnected. It's really just looking at those three things through the lens of purpose.
Now, there is a body of work in a field called behavioral ethics that tries to get at some of these disjunctures, and it's almost how we set ourselves up for failure all the time. And I recommend this book called Blind Spots by Notre Dame Business School professor Ann Tenbrunsell, which is precisely on this point. It looks at things like moral licensing, that as soon as we see ourselves acting in some way that we think is morally praiseworthy, we make compromises in other areas. And we don't realize we're doing it, but there's a whole host of behaviors like this that are happening in companies all the time. And so there's, leadership again has the onus to sort of try to figure out how to be attentive to that and really be vigilant about these sorts of things.
Huh. So if I have a Diet Coke and I have a cheeseburger, then
Right.
is that kind of okay?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, Lent is, for all of us, I think, we should be
Right.
hyper attentive because
Okay, got it. All right. So kind of going back to the themes then and looking at the future of work, or where are we going in the future? Is there such a thing as the future of work? Is that actually a thing? Is that something that really is something that we can define, or is it the nature of work that changes? Does the nature of work stay the same? What are your opinions on that? John, what are your
I mean,
thoughts?
certainly there are things happening that are setting trends about the future of work in terms of the use of technology, the types of skills that are going to be more and more valuable. That has to do also with analyzing data, but also interpreting data in ways that is meaningful for organizations. Data is out there and it's going to be more prevalent
Sure.
and more useful in decision making. So this work is changing, but I think the power of ingenuity is going to be highlighted even more. So it's not just repetitive work, it's actually much of the work will be thrown aside. So can we create cultures in organizations that attract that talent? Can we create teams that where you are actually improving each other's by the way you work? Can we also create a sense of purpose that I guess unifies the efforts of everybody in the organization in the same direction? So those, I think, there's an opportunity which I think is happening because of technology, but I think in a way some of the things that we already saw years ago
Sure.
to highlight the impact of people, of teams, and of purpose. I think we're seeing that even more so today.
Right. No, I certainly see that. It's just a matter of, I kind of think about, millennia ago, were people thinking about the future of work and what does that actually mean, and here we are, if we had to kind of project, what does that mean? And is there such a thing? So I take your point that it's about how we can actually get better and how we can link different purposes. And Phil, let me throw it over to you. I mean, is there such a thing as the future of work? What are your opinion on that?
I would parrot similar thoughts. I've heard it mentioned that we're moving into an era out of the information age into the purpose economy. I've heard that stated, and I think there's some truth to that. And we talked about AI these past couple of days, and the idea of AI not replacing but enhancing the person. I think that's a really critical, again, framework to think about, is how are we enhancing the person as we move forward. And we went through the information technology, we're still in it, or the information era, and if we are shifting in, but we have into the purpose economy, we have all this access to information, right? And so the control and the power is really shifting from corporate powers to individual. And that's why you see the birth of entrepreneurship and everybody moving into this, because they have the ability to do that. And so I think that's a huge thing. It's a huge opportunity. I'm excited about that. But there's, the AI and some of those things. I think we have to keep, if we keep the focus on the person and that idea of it, those ideas and trends enhancing the person, I think that would be great.
Brandon, is there such a, I'm sorry, John, were you going to say something?
Can I add something to that? One thing
Yeah.
that technology is also doing is giving us the power to customize our offering to the individual, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So that's another thing, that the focus on the person can be also highlighted, the customer, right? Attention of the company towards the
Oh,
each
so you can
individual
focus on the
customer.
uniqueness of
Each
the
individual.
person.
Yeah.
I mean, you certainly have that within the acquisition of data to be able to, if you look at designer drugs, pharmaceuticals, clothes, those types of things. And, so Brandon, thinking about then large corporations down to that individual, the ability to contribute to the economy, is there such a thing, and if not, what would it take to get to a purpose-driven economy? What is that?
Yeah, purpose is, I'm a little ambivalent about the term because whose purpose, right?
Right.
And also which person, right? So I see the kinds of trends moving in, at least a couple of different directions. One is what we've been talking about here, which is sort of a more humanizing, and by putting the human person as we understand it through sort of a Christian anthropology, someone with a dignity that they don't themselves invent or create, but one that is inherent to them, and that would sort of help reveal that, right? That's one possibility. There's another possibility where you can have a manipulative model of purpose, where purposes are harnessed, that people, that persons are, they are whatever you want them to be, right? And you can manipulate them genetically in various ways and so forth. So there's that dystopian future as well that's still looming. And I think we really have to try to figure out how to invest in harnessing this first vision. There are places I see it happening where, in some of my work in Italy, we really are trying to identify where is it that we find this kind of personhood being cultivated, and what does it take to do that? And we find these three patterns in the organizations we study. One is the nature of the relationship between the self and the other, between the boss and the employee, between the organization and the community, and it's one in which you've got the person with power, so the boss, not dominating the employee, but instead trying to initiate and nurture something in them and let them go. So you see organizations that nurture spin-offs, which is a very weird idea for a lot of us Americans, because we think, shouldn't you be imposing a non-competition clause?
Right.
And they go, no, we actually want these people to flourish. We take a bet on their dignity, and we think it's going to be good for not just the economy, but our society and so on. Now, this is Italy that's reeling from 2008. They still haven't recovered. So there is this sort of long-term vision for how can we, as a society, really move forward. So that's one dimension. The second dimension is connecting past and future, and they try to innovate based on tradition, based on rootedness. So again, I think that's an aspect of human dignity we need to consider. We come from somewhere,
Right.
And again, it's hard for a lot of us in America to have that sense of place and a sense of history.
Right.
And the third engine is the public and private. So realizing that we see this sort of economy of purpose stuff, right? So organizations need some public validation, right? Someone has to say, yes, what you're doing is good. It's meeting a real need in the world. But how do we assess that vis-a-vis the common good? Is this a real good that's being met, or is it the kind of good that pornography offers? Which there are customers that want this, but is it really good, right? So
That's right. Well, and it goes back to, again, are you, what's more ethical, right? A nonprofit that's serving soup that's run horribly, or a really well-run pornography shop. I mean, to your point, and you're like, wait a minute. So, are you actually driving towards human dignity? Are you actually, you're not only your intent, but the structure and the organization, the policies in order to kind of create that. So, within our remaining time here, why don't we just kind of, again, let's get laser focused on the practical and, what are the one or two things, again, on Tuesday, that as we recover from our weekend, what are the things that are, that we can start doing, on Tuesday? John, what are the one or two things?
Well, one thing is certainly think of your job as a manager, if you happen to be one, to build people, to help develop people. So incorporate that as part of your mission, if that's truly part of what's driving the success of the organization, but also for its own sake. Build people, think of that as an essential part of your job as a manager. Think also of inculcating a sense of generosity within the team, and by first of all giving a good example so that you contribute to the work of others and help others also contribute to the work of the others. And lastly, on the point of making of impact and purpose, Also connect people as closely as you can to what the company is providing its customers. So make the impact visible, right? So that there's lots of people who feel like cogs in the machine, and that's why their job has no sense of purpose. But the minute you see people benefiting on the other side from the work that you do, then that's empowering, and that's a motivational push.
That's great points. Thank you. Brandon.
Yeah, a couple of points. I mean, one, I think we've talked about the role of the leader in all of this, and there's just one lesson that comes to mind from Google's Laszlo Bock, which is a method he used to use is just to ask employees, tell me one thing I could do differently, and then one thing you could do differently. So I use this when I teach. I constantly have these sort of evaluation sort of mid-semester, like a couple of times during a course, where I ask students, all right, what's working well, what's not working well? What can I do differently? One thing, and what can you do differently? Just one thing. And then they buy into this, because they invest in the change you're trying to bring about. And then I think the role of community for leaders, I think, is crucial. So I can, in India, I'm trying to see if I can create a group of Catholic business people who have an accountability group to each other, not as a kind of careerist sort of, accountability. That's not like saying, have you moved to vice president yet kind of thing, but to sort of say, how are you better implementing Catholic social teaching, in the way you're living out your vocation in the workplace. So those would be two kinds of things that I would suggest.
Great, thank you. Bill.
I'll go even more granular a bit. I'd say this is the number one priority, and that is focusing on the interpersonal relationships within your organization. So the number one project for leadership is to ensure that the team itself is healthy, and from there all else flows. So elevate your organizational interpersonal relationships. You can do this through intentionally through interdependencies between people and groups and teams, through shared commitments, through shared missions between individuals and teams to start to, again, form the structures that they can start to participate in a form of community. The second one, I think, is create a common language. We talked a bit about that, but around purpose and values. And we use heuristics in our organization. Example is that is like in the All Blacks. The Culture Code is a great book. All Blacks use this, the rugby team in New Zealand. But we use bent knee approach because one of our values is empathetic leadership. That's a value that we prize in our organization. So bent knee is a way to express to people that this is what we expect, which you arrive to the person with a humble stance, and you listen to them first. You don't make sweeping judgments about this, that, or the other. So that's, forming common language around purpose and values. And the last one is just focus on bar-setting behaviors. So really go the extra mile to recognize, to appreciate, and to call out those behaviors and those actions that are consistent with the values and principles of the organization. And a way that we do this is through highlighting the virtues. So everybody is unique. Everybody has certain pitfalls that they have relative to who they are and their nature. So we call out the different virtues relative to the values that we have in our organization, and we do that once a week. We'll have a little service award. We give $100. It's like so-and-so lived out this practice, and they communicated with a customer in a difficult situation in such and such a way, and this exemplified this virtue, and it was that connected to that value. And so connecting virtue and value can do that. So.
Well, very, very good. Well, gentlemen, thank you so very much. Really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Great job.
Good job.
Thanks.